Today's November 13th, 2024, and I'm honored to have Jack Cashill, who is an easy, clear thinker and writer, and presents lucid cases as a debunker and uncover, a genuine journalist. If that's still a term, that's a compliment, but I think it should be, and he is. And he's going to talk to us about the truth and reconciliation, whether there should be any for those who persecuted and prosecuted January 6th, and what happens now that we are, in the kind of the restoration framework of the second Trump tenure.
Well, thanks for having me on, Randy. It's always an honor, always a pleasure to talk to someone who knows as much as you do. So it's kind of a fun place to start the conversation.
Well, the Reichstag fire, I keep thinking of. Is that what we had? Was this kind of a big, aggrandized psyop? You have a picture of your family behind you. I don't, but I do have a family. And my older son is a very knowledgeable guy. And one of the kind of bones that he couldn't quite swallow for Trump, but is this January 6th business, that it was an insurrection, that he backed the insurrection, et cetera. I think this is a pretty common framework. And he's not of the left per se, he's kind of in the middle, I guess. But I'm wondering what's truth, what's illusion? How do you frame it all? What's your work showing you, and how are things going to play out in the near future? Are there going to be hearings? Are there going to be reverse prosecutions? Are they going to be trusted? Are they just going to be seen as kind of reverse partisan?
It's interesting, Randy, because just a little while ago, I got a text from someone who I hadn't talked to in a while. And he said, "Hey, I hear Trump is talking about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission." And he brought that to my attention because he knew I'd written a couple articles in the past, arguing just for a South Africa style commission like that, because the notion of prosecuting the people who did judicial wrong during this last 4 years through the DC courts would go nowhere. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the way it worked in South Africa, was after not after the fall of apartheid. Apartheid only fell with the agreement of the people who were running it, knowing that they could get amnesty if they simply told the truth about what they had done in their official capacities. And it worked out. I mean, South Africa has no future, but it worked out pretty well at the time. And we're now 30 years beyond that. We're better than many people had anticipated. And that's what I would recommend here. Well, my contact says, "Hey, Trump is talking now about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission." He asked me if I had any responsibility for that. And I said, I will say this, is that my very best contact at Trump had seen my article about this and said she would pass it along. Now, I don't know if, who knows? No one's called me up and said, "Jack, hey, do you want to be the chair of this commission?" But I'd love to see that happen, because I think it's what's necessary to happen, because the dishonesty around the subject of January 6th is so profound that most people on the right are confused, including, unfortunately, would-be Senate majority leaders like Toon and Cronin, who are continuing to talk about an insurrectionist. What we can say for sure, Randy, is that it was not an insurrection. What we can also say for sure is that it mirrored the Reichstag fire of, I believe, 1933 in the way it played out. Whether it was planned, we don't really know, just like we don't really know who set the Reichstag fire. It may have been set, by the people they accused of setting it. But what we do know is that the authorities exploited the uncertainty to launch a reign of judicial terror on their political foes.
Yeah, no, I think that's fairly apt. The January 6th commission had omissions.
Yeah.
Did they not? Didn't they?
Yeah, they lied about the most basic things. For instance, the lies of omission. They never, in 800 pages, they never quote Trump as saying, we have to march peacefully and patriotically to the Capitol. What they do quote Trump as saying is we have to fight, fight, fight. What they don't say is that Trump said that at 1:10 p.m., a full 75 minutes after the riot started at the Capitol building, which is a 45-minute walk away. So in other words, all of those people who breached the perimeter, led by the ubiquitous Ray Epps, all those people who were protesting on the west front of the Capitol when the police started lobbing munitions at them, did not hear Trump speak. Trump was still speaking 45 minutes away when the police started to fire on the protesters. So that whole thing was Trump was almost an irrelevant player in that brouhaha. His people, the people who heard his speech, didn't get to the Capitol until 90 minutes after the action started.
So when you say the ubiquitous Ray Epps, I mean, how ubiquitous was he? I mean, we're talking about a crowd of thousands, tens of thousands. Yeah. I'm not sure the exact number. Like, why are we focused on one person, and what could one person have done in this case? And I understand there's some shady aspects, and he didn't get prosecuted, whatnot. So again, it's kind of an omission as well, like the Sherlock Holmes dog that didn't bark in the night.
That's right.
The fact that they didn't prosecute him should mean something. But who is he? What was his role? And agent provocateur or what? But why are we focused on him when there were so many other actors around?
You know, I think I'm confident there were other Ray Eppses in that crowd. Epps, made himself obvious the night before by, talking to a crowd and telling them they had to go into the Capitol. And the crowd is chanting, "Fed, Fed, Fed." They think he's a provocateur. And I'm sure they're right. The next day, he is the one at the front of the initial breach on the perimeter of the Capitol. He's the one at the front of the secondary breach at the west front of the Capitol. He has a hands-on role in pushing a large metal sign into a row of police. He brags to his nephew that he helped orchestrate this whole thing. And yet 3 years go by and he's not arrested. Not only is he not arrested, he's treated like an endangered species by the White House, by the J6, the House J6 committee. He's obviously getting special treatment, embarrassingly special treatment, to the point where finally they had to arrest him and gave him a 1-year probation for crimes that other people are now serving 20 years for. He was just too conspicuous to ignore. His size and his, obvious visibility made him a flashpoint, but we know there were others like him in there doing the same thing, just more subtly.
So has there been research to Ray Epps' actual career and connections? And what was he?
Yeah, there's been some. His background would be, the classic background for a confidential human source. He was a member of the Oath Keepers. He had the kind of background that you get turned on. If they have some information on you and they need you and they want you to do something, they can turn you. And apparently he was turned. What agency turned him, I cannot tell you. Likely the FBI, because that was the FBI's MO in Michigan on the Whitmer kidnapping, which half the 20 people involved in that case, it's total BS case, were either FBI agents or informants. It's it was a total put-up job in Michigan. And of course, it was revealed just 2 weeks before the election in 2020 that there had been this white terrorist plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. It was all nonsense. And most of those charges were thrown out. But that was after the fact. The damage had been done. So
if you were the chief prosecutor, kind of like akin to a Dr. Fauci trial, perhaps upcoming.
Right.
But I'm not sure who the Dr. Fauci, good guy / bad guy, depending on how you look at it. I'm sure the Democrats must have some hero or heroes of the January 6th aspect. But let's say you're the prosecutor against this type of figure. How would you make your case, and what are the best indicators of exaggeration and over criminalizing?
I would start with Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris is another flashpoint in this whole story, and not many people know why. But on the morning of January 6th, she started the day at the Capitol. She's the vice president-elect, still a U.S. senator, and so she would be involved in the whole the hearings, not the hearings, but rather the certification process that was scheduled for that afternoon. But she left the Capitol and went to the DNC offices, which are a block or so away from the Capitol. And at the 1 o'clock witching hour, when Ray Epps first breaches the perimeter, when the pipe bombs are found outside the RNC and the DNC, when the hangman puts his noose up on the fake gallows that had been set up on the lawn, she's at the DNC. I don't think the plotters, and there are plotters involved, knew she was going to be there. I don't think she was part of that plot. I think she was there independently, but by being there, she threw a wrench into the plot, because with her was her Secret Service detail, and their Secret Service detail brought along the bomb sniffing dogs, and they did the routine, sniffing of the exterior of the DNC, and they missed the bomb that allegedly had been planted the night before, right? For which there's a $500,000 reward. The FBI is still offering that story. So she wasn't supposed to be there. And as a result, what they had to make her do was to disappear her. And this was really pretty astonishing when you look at it, Randy. So on January 17th, Kamala's on CBS Good Morning with Jane Pauley. And Pauley asked him, an obvious question, what was your day like on January 6th? That had to be quite, tumultuous. And Kamala says, yeah, I was, gosh. I was at the Capitol and we had this meeting and I was evacuated. And then, I was taken to a safe place with her, girlfriend beating husband, Doug Emhoff. And she didn't say girlfriend beating. I added that in. I editorialized that. And that was the story. She stuck to that story for a year. She led people to believe, this included the prosecutors and the judges on the hundreds of J6 cases that were coming through, that she was at the Capitol all day and not at the DNC. As a result, they amplified the charges against literally hundreds of J6ers for having infringed on the space of a Secret Service protectee. That was Kamala Harris, who was alleged to be at the Capitol during the riot. It would be until November, 11 months after, that finally it was revealed that she wasn't at the Capitol. And so they had to amend all these filings. It was kind of embarrassing. And then it wasn't until the first anniversary that she herself acknowledged she wasn't at the Capitol during the riot. But she has never acknowledged that she was at the DNC. And what I think the reason for this is that the DNC bombs, and maybe even the RNC bombs, they're together, were planted by friends of the administration. And so Kamala becomes the dog that didn't bark. She should have been saying all this past 4 years, oh, Trump was a near victim of an assassination. How about me? That bomb, I was within 20 feet of a bomb that could have blown up the whole building, right? Doesn't say it, never says it, hasn't still said it, not to this day. Because the bombs were part of the instigation, the way to blame this whole day on Donald Trump and his supporters. As it turned out, they weren't necessary, but they remained in the news. And every time they were talked about, Randy, they were talked about as though they were part of the Trump plot to disrupt the hearings at the Capitol that day.
So a few things. So how do we know if she doesn't admit she was there? How do we know she was there? A, and then B, were these? You think these bombs were meant to be set off, and were they rigged? And who had the trigger?
I don't think they were meant to be set off. I mean, they had, each one of them had an hour, kitchen timer on it, right? and they were allegedly planted like the night before. So the FBI continues to tell us. So I didn't quite get the math there. I don't know, unless I think they're just fake bombs done to create a scare, possibly. And in this regard, it did work. It drew Capitol Police away from the Capitol. So they had to come, tend to the bombs. But I think the whole thing was part of a plot to discredit Trump and his movement. And it proved not to be the lead item in that plot. But if they had not succeeded in instigating a riot, it probably would have been.
So video cameras are omnipresent, I assume, in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, everywhere.
I would imagine around the DNC and the RNC in D.C. Right. Wouldn't there be some kind of like photo trail of people leaving bombs the night before?
Well, the FBI alleged to show someone, planting a bomb the night before. And, but they amazingly, although they were there to arrest 1,500 protesters on January 6th, they couldn't identify this person. Everything that had to work broke, everything is suspect, they've not, but instead they offer a $500,000 reward. But the truth is, we saw on these surveillance cameras on the day of January 6th, and this has only come out within the last year, thanks to the work of congressional committees, the presence of the Secret Service outside the DNC at that hour, at 1 o'clock and before. We've seen the security footage. What's interesting is they have this one, and this is relatively recent, image video that showed up, and again, thanks to the congressional Republicans for surfacing it, of a Metropolitan police officer, that's the DC police, getting out of a car with a bag, walking over towards the bench where the bomb was found, a half hour later, and walking back. We don't see, the video ends when he leaves the frame. So we don't see where he goes with that bag, but he's back a minute or two later, still with the bag. So who knows? I would love to get at that. I think we need a new J6 committee hearing, a real one, that gets at the truth of this. And as my first witness, I'd call Kamala Harris.
Interesting. Are you sure he didn't have the excess votes from Fulton County in that box?
That might have been it too. Yeah, right. I don't think the bag was big enough for that.
That's interesting. So, so we got Kamala Harris, somewhat duplicitous. This is going to be a shock for people.
Yeah.
But we can presume she wasn't orchestrating any of this.
No, I think she was. I don't think she was on the plot at all. Nor do I think Nancy Pelosi was in on the plot. Because what surfaced also within the last 6 months or so was that video of a frantic Nancy Pelosi leaving the Capitol. Her daughter Alexandra shoots it, making a documentary, and she's basically saying, "Oh, we screwed up. How did we do this? Where's the National Guard? Blah blah blah." She wasn't faking it. She was hysterical. The people who were plotting it, and I'm of the opinion there was more than one entity involved in trying to instigate a riot or to exaggerate or exacerbate a riot that was already underway. And among the culprits, I would include the DNC, because they'd done it before in 2016, we know, with a practice called bird dogging, which James O'Keefe and Project Veritas unearthed, where they would give mentally ill or homeless people like baseball bats, tell them to go into a Trump crowd, start a ruckus, and the media would inevitably blame it on the Trump people, right? Well, I know in at least one case that I unearthed in my investigation, and in my book, Ashli, The Untold Story of the Women of January 6th, a guy named Emmanuel Jackson, black guy, homeless, 21 years old. He's in there with a baseball bat for 2 hours swinging at police, right? He's interviewed by another protester, and he tells him, mumbles something about globalism, right? Well, he's arrested, and he walks away unscathed. They let him go. no one was more violent for a more extended period of time than Emmanuel Jackson. They just let him walk, right? You see this time after time in multiple cases. People who were conspicuously provocateurs and conspicuously violent, like the crew that hangs up the gallows or constructs the gallows and at 1 o'clock, the witching hour, puts up the noose. They're visible. You could photo identify them like you did everyone else. Nope, not identified. Or the guy they call the scaffold commander, standing on top of the media scaffold with a bullhorn, electric bullhorn, urging people to go into the Capitol. Face is clear as day, recognition. And they don't identify him. No, it's there are others in the crowd. Others may have planted them in the crowd. They shared one thing in common, and that is they wanted to get the Trump movement discredited, and they succeeded.
Well, people will accuse you of begging the question, petitio principi, that is to put your own feelings and sensibilities in advance of the fact, that you're interpreting this through a lens that it's agent provocateur, that it was done as an inside job of some type. What's the actual proof? How do we know it was not, can kind of take devil's advocate here. How do we know it's not what it was, what it seemed to have been? And I guess as an ancillary point, there's the story of not the police officer who shot Ashli Babbitt, but the other guy who's got trotted out in front of CNN over and over again.
Already done, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you could touch on point A and then point B.
Yeah, how do we prove? Well, first of all, we have to concede that there are some real yahoos in that crowd who are legitimate Trump supporters. That's a given, okay? We're not denying that. But if you're going to stage an insurrection, you think someone would have brought a gun, right? No one brought a gun into the Capitol. No one, right? And then we have guys, the lying on their side is so profound that, and their tolerance of those lies and their open suborning of perjury. In the case of Officer Harry Dunn, for instance, a Capitol Police officer, grandstanding his way through the day, or in the case of Cassidy Hutchinson, the White House staffer who told of how Donald Trump tried to strangle the Secret Service driver of his vehicle, right? And we know now that she and Liz Cheney were communicating off channel. It's a sea of lies, and that's why they need to be peeled back. What the exact truth is, I cannot tell you that I know. I don't know anyone who knows really this case much better than I do, other than maybe Julie Kelly. But I know that they are lying to cover stuff up. And the question is, how deep can we go? And the best way is not through the courts. The best way is through a commission that promises amnesty.
Well, let me just take issue with that as well. The way you stipulated the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that there was under some threat of punishment otherwise. Now, if this stuff is all going to work its way through the DC courts, and DC is, I don't know what percent they would think voted 95% for Biden. I don't know, maybe 90% for Kamala.
Actually, Trump did relatively well this time.
If there's no threat of prosecution from the DC courts, what's the hammer or the club?
Well, the hammer is, I tell you what, even as the many Trump people have experienced, the hammer is the threat, is the process, right? You still got to lawyer up. You still got to spend gazillions of dollars to defend yourself. You still have to go through the motions. You can expect to be acquitted perhaps at the end of the day, but you're still going to be bankrupt. And they do that now purposefully. Kamala Harris, when she was in California, bragged about doing that.
Yeah, no, I know.
I've seen the videos of her just absolutely bragging. We can bring charges and drop them a day later, but we wreck these people's lives, right? She was very cavalier about it.
What fun, huh?
Yeah, right. And that's the threat. And who knows? Maybe if their crimes are so egregious and the embarrassment they cause is so profound to their own side that they will find some grace and begin to actually act as responsible citizens. By the way, I should say, Randy, Donald Trump increased his DC percentage of the vote from 5 to 6.5%. So,
that's 30% right there.
Yeah, right. It's major, you know.
So yeah, no, I always thought it's kind of a again, that Silver Blaze Sherlock Holmes story, the dog that didn't bark. There's a lot of things that happen. The way that the January 6th Commission put together its tapes and so forth. But let me ask you kind of a constructive question here for people who want to investigate this on their own and become Jack Cashill smart. I assume there's been some Reddit or external reconstruction of all this by interested parties. Is there a kind of a living timeline or?
Yeah, there is. There's one very good video put together by an independent group, and I believe it's just called the real January 6th timeline or the true January 6th timeline. Find it on Rumble or probably even YouTube. It's just straightforward, walks you through the timeline, and once you see the timeline, once you see what happens, the mystery dissolves. It's not that complicated what happened. And it's not too complicated as to what prompted it and what provoked it and what nurtured the riot. A lot of it was just bad decision-making on part of the Capitol Police. Much of it was incompetence. But there's a line between incompetence and conspiracy that's blurry, and one leads into the other. And I think people on the conspirators understood they could mask a lot of their bad behavior through the incompetence of the people who were put in the front line.
So didn't Donald Trump ask for National Guard? Didn't he ask for Capitol Police?
Yes, he did.
Who rebuffed it? Who runs the National Guard in a place that's not a state?
That goes directly to the Department of Defense. So the acting head of the Department of Defense at the time, Chris Miller, I believe his name is, had admitted he had full authority to respond to the request for the Guard. Trump had requested about 3 days before. 4 people were present, including General Milley, who's a total traitorous snake, who put out the rumor that, and this is testified to by the chief attorney for the National Guard, which were appalled by what happened to them that day, the fact they were kept out of the picture. And he's a black guy. His boss is black too. So they're not exactly, you would expect to be MAGA types. But he testified to a Democratic woman, who was trying to bait him into saying that about Trump's role with respect to the National Guard. He said, no, Milley is the one who suppressed it because he spread the rumor that Trump was going to use the National Guard to take over the White House, to stay in office, to suppress Congress, et cetera. And then the congresswoman asked him, well, do you believe that? She goes, no. He goes, it's total BS, right? He said no one believes it except a handful of people around General Milley. But that was the mood of the Pentagon. And that's why they slow walked that request. Even on the day of January 6th, they slow walked the request. The Capitol Police Chief is one of the few straight shooters in this whole episode, Steve Son. He requested them immediately upon the first breach of the perimeter. And they don't arrive until 5 hours later when they're just there for show. And now the National Guard was appalled. Curiously, Ashli Babbitt, the subject of my book, had been a member of that very National Guard unit some years before.
Everyone hears of all the deaths that occurred amongst the police. I imagine that's been debunked, but has the legacy media ever kind of walked that back? The Brian Sicknick story, et cetera.
They have done it. They've never said, gosh, we were wrong. We led the American people thinking that this is a lethal insurrection. No, but they've gradually changed the story. They fudge it now, they'll say 5 officers who died as a consequence of January 6th, but they've stopped saying that 5 officers were killed on January 6th. They've stopped saying that Brian Sicknick was killed on January 6th. They said that at the time, and it was enormously effective. The New York Times reported on January 8th that he had been killed by pro-Trump supporters who bludgeoned him with a fire extinguisher. And they added this detail that he had been rushed out of the Capitol with the blood flowing from a gash in his head. Totally made up story. And they held it for more than 100 days by sitting on the autopsy report. And then they memorialized his death by putting his ashes in the rotunda of the Capitol and burying him with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. A total lie. Probably the most ghoulish hoax in American political history. And they got away with it long enough to impress it on the minds of the people who didn't want to know anymore.
So is it possible to importune the New York Reporter to reveal the source for that? Is that kosher?
Yeah, I think it should, because they cite 2 law enforcement officials as their source, right? That should not, it's not a state secret. I can't imagine the defense against being asked to, because that's some part of it that could be, Randy, that could be unraveled. That's one part of this whole plot that could be unraveled. There's lots of side plots, but that one is subject to quick deconstruction. And who planted that story and why? And that's going to go higher up than the 2 law enforcement officials. That's got to come from pretty high up. Because Sicknick dies on January 7th of a series of strokes that had nothing to do with January 6th.
Yeah. The New York Times, it's like the center of my Zika story. It's the center of the COVID overreaction.
Right.
And what else?
Well, and it's really the center of the left's media universe. It's because the other media wait for essentially the New York Times to put its imprimatur on a given story, and then they go with it. TV networks wait on the New York Times. They have historically. The American people, to a large degree, to trust the New York Times, unaware just how incrementally they've been corrupted over the last, especially in the Trump era, the last 10 years, where the corruption's out of hand. I think that's all about to blow up. I mean, it's blown up now. I mean, I see why we saw in this just last week in the election that the mainstream media, is no longer mainstream, but it's no longer dominant. The combined forces of the Joe Rogans and Elon Musks and the Megyn Kellys and Tucker Carlsons overwhelmed it. And a year or 2 ago, January 6th would have been enough to crush Trump's chances. By this election, enough people knew that the whole thing was a put-up job, that it slowed him down, but it didn't stop him. Had the National Guard been called out, as they should have been early on January 6th, today we think of January 6th as just another day on the calendar, right? And Trump's march to the second term would have been more of a rout than it proved to be. He would have won New Jersey. He would have won New Mexico and New Hampshire.
So, did you have a career in newspapers, or how did you come to the role that you're doing now?
It's kind of somewhat. I've been a writer for a long time professionally, but mostly commercially, and I worked in advertising, and I continued to write for journals and stuff, because I have a PhD in American Studies, and and I've always been interested in American culture, affairs, politics. But I was once the internet hit, I was able to change my focus from doing commercial work to doing independent investigation, because all of a sudden I had the same repertorial control as the New York Times did. I had access to all that information. So before that, it would have been taken far too long and too much effort. I just didn't have the resources to write counter narratives. But once I saw that door open, I rushed in. I've written 15 books in the last 20 years. Done 13 book TVs on C-SPAN. And, I found a career from the crumbs the major media left on the table.
Yeah, no, it's a funny thing. The media and their ancillary co-runners, the universities and quote unquote Hollywood, they're willing to leave a lot of crumbs on the table. They only seem to want to put, bat from one side of the plate and hit to one side of the field, and they leave a lot of openings, which, it's taking time for the other people to craft a narrative and whatnot. But it seems like so much of it is not news, but rather promotion or propaganda.
Yeah, it is. And, when I first got into this, I could not believe how conspicuous they were in shaping stories. So, for instance, I did a book on the death of Commerce Secretary Ron Brown, which came out about 20 years ago. And, as I was investigating, I was really just investigating the corruption that led him to be put on that plane to Croatia, the fatal plane crash. Never suspecting. And I told my publishers, and they offered me a nice advance. I said, I'm not going to crash this plane to sell books. If the plane just crashed, it just crashed. I'm going to talk about why he was on that plane, because the level of corruption in that 2-year period before the 96 election has never been reached before or since. But then I figured, I couldn't close the deal without at least requesting the 22-volume report done by the U.S. Air Force on the plane crash. And then when I contacted the Air Force, I was told I was the first person in the media to ask for it. Now I'm writing 7 years after the fact. And the New York Times had a reporter on the plane who died, right? They never asked to see the report. And my first request went through some functionary, and they told me it's going to cost thousands of dollars and it's going to take months before they could send it to me. It was a paper copy. And I said, I emailed them back. I said, I'm sorry, I don't have the time or the money to do that. I'm going to have to live with the summary because I'm not expecting to find anything. And then I get it's overridden by a colonel in Germany, Ramstein. And he says that it'll be there within a week and we're waiving all fees. The report comes on a pallet, right, from the UPS. And there's boxes and boxes. So I'd already written a book on TWA Flight 800. So I was in touch with some, people with the aviation expertise, 2 captains of international airlines. And I gave them the technical data to go through. And I took the interviews and all the other information. We sorted through it. And voila, at the end of the day, I said, I can't prove this with 100% confidence, but the dispassionate observer looking at this evidence says this plane was sabotaged. They killed him, I'm sure they contracted it out to the Croatian intelligence, who is totally indebted to the Clinton administration. But this was no accident. And the New York Times wasn't interested. And even though Ron Brown was a beloved character in the Black community, in fact, I got a lot of support from the Black media who were interested in the outcome of the book, but got totally, even when I revealed for this first time that the reason that Brown went to Croatia extensively was to broker a sweetheart deal between the fascists who ran the country and the Enron Corporation. I could get no media traction. They didn't even want to know about that, right? And I said, but the Enron executives at the last minute chose to take their own plane. How about that? No, I'm not interested. You can hammer them over the head with the story that if it doesn't fit their agenda, and this is 20 years ago, they're going to turn it back on it.
That a fair amount of the legacy media, they'll cover a story, but with a pillow until it doesn't breathe.
That's well said, because that's the way they do it. And then if you're the one who tells the story, then they invented a new term for you, conspiracy theorist. So you go to my Wikipedia page, it's Jack Cashill, conspiracy theorist. All right. Yeah. So what's your prediction? What's the, if there's like not a smoking gun, but a can opener to undo this January 6th perception,
how would you reformulate it? And what are the, I guess you've gone over a number of them, but if you had to do your closing, Johnny Cochran, maybe not a good example, but Clarence Darrow or whatever, closing argument for this case, how do you phrase it? How do you convince the jury and whatnot of the, kind of, say, subversive or provocateur aspects to this? And is that the only explanation?
Well, and you raise an interesting point, Brandy, in that it is such a multi-pronged thing. It's hard to collapse it into one narrative. But that's why I would start with Kamala and make her the focus. And then I would go to Liz Cheney and make her the secondary focus. That is, why did you suborn Cassidy Hutchinson's perjury? We could prove that, right? We could prove that of Kamala Harris. Why did you lie about your presence at the DNC on January 6th? These are the kind of questions you need to peel everything back. And then we'll begin to find out who the real operatives were behind the scene. Like, who told those two law enforcement officials to lie to the New York Times? When you add a detail like rushed out of the Capitol with a gash in his head, that's not a miscommunication. That's disinformation. So you find those weak points, those flashpoints, and then you expose them there. There's going to be many, and I can't right now. If you ask me who is the main operative behind all this, I couldn't tell you. I don't think anyone could. But I think there were multiple people involved and multiple entities involved, and I think finally we're going to track them back to the DNC and their lawyers. For instance, when the question came up of Kamala Harris working at McDonald's, I opined, I said, I wrote just a little tweet. I said, if the attorneys at Perkins Coie were capable of finding Barack Obama's birth certificate, and if they were capable of creating the Steele dossier, how hard can it be to manufacture a W-2 for Kamala Harris? I think when we get back to the heart of it, we're going to find some cabal located within some Washington law firm working with some high-level players in the DNC and their big money sources.
Yeah. So I stopped celebrating Valentine's Day. April Fool's Day, because I got too good at it. Like 40 years ago, thereabouts, I was a young doctor, and I was at a walk-in clinic. I didn't own it. I was just kind of peripatetic and salaried here and there. And the staff didn't like the head nurse, and they thought they wanted me to do the April Fool's trick on her. And this is like before the internet and everything like that. And I knew she liked a certain person who came in pretty regularly. And I found his chart. I took out the letterhead and I made a letter from it. I Xeroxed it and, made it look like, real letter that he wanted to come in instead of just as a patient and see her, so forth. Anyway, the thing worked so incredibly well. And then she was brokenhearted, and it brought a real fissure to the office. And I didn't know of what I was doing. That they kind of, I don't know where the idea came from. I don't think it was my idea per se, but I helped bring it to birth, and it was a horrible thing. I felt miserable over this. She wept, and it was a trick gone wrong. But I think people are certainly capable of tricks, and I know that we have a whole day dedicated to April Fools, and this has to be kind of a level of scrutiny and examination for when things happen. And when you totally ignore that possibility, I think you're part of the thing. If you're not holding adequate hearings, and if you omit certain aspects, then it calls the whole thing into question. But kind of getting a little bit back, you can comment on any of that if you want. But the fact I'm kind of puzzled over is, were they led into the Capitol? Was there a breach of the Capitol?
Yeah, I mean, that's not hard to track. We know what time the first windows were broken. It was a little after 2:00. Trump's people hadn't even reached the Capitol yet when the windows were broken. But there was a lot of incompetence involved that led to provocation. So, for instance, the police are firing this, various kinds of gas at the crowd, which they should never have been doing. It was crazy. Just bad police work. They don't know what they're doing. These people are usually just giving out parking tickets and escorting old ladies around the Capitol. They're in for a day that they weren't anticipating. But at one point, they gassed themselves. The thing misfires, the wind blows it all back. They don't have masks on. They have to run back into the Capitol. The crowd follows them in, right? Follows them back to the entrance. These kind of things happened all day. There was not that one shining moment. If there was a moment, it was at 12:53 when Ray Epps and this guy named Ryan Samsel breached that first bike rack, right? And they knock over a policewoman and they stop and pick her back up to her feet. These aren't hardcore insurrectionists. They don't do that. This is like a psyop, and it was, it worked pretty well. It has for 4 years. And I think the unraveling will be great because I think America needs to, I've got several stories that I'm the chief literary custodian of that I'd love to see unraveled. The destruction of TWA Flight 800, the destruction of Ron Brown's aircraft, the authorship of Dreams from My Father, the Trayvon hoax, a whole series of major lies that have been sold to the American people that have been enormously consequential. And there's a lot more than the ones I'm sort of the manager of. On January 6th, I'm really just a team player here. I'm not the lead.
Right. Well, you do have your book, and I'm going to put it up here so people can see. Yeah. Oops, wrong thing here. Let's see. Better get this bigger. Sorry about that.
Here we are. Ashli, the untold story of the women of January 6th. Just in a nutshell, Randy, of the 10 women I profile in this book, 8 of them survived. 2 were killed that day, Ashli Babbitt and Roseanne Boylan, about almost nothing is known about her. Except I can tell the story, and it's not hard to tell. But of the other 8, all of them are either in prison or have been to prison. And I should say incarcerated. One was a home incarceration, including a great grandmother, right, who drove to Washington by herself from Colorado. It's really amazing, when you look at these cases. Of the 8 women, only one did something that you and I might consider a crime, and that is she helped break a window, for which this mother of 8 is serving 4.5 years in prison, right? The women who disrupted the Kavanaugh proceedings, by contrast, who had to be carried out of the Senate chambers there, received $30 to $50 fines. All right, I mean, that's the difference. It's just this massive injustice that our friends on the left they're not even aware of it, and too many on the right don't want to know about it.
In the context of earlier in 2020, well, not earlier, I mean, 7 months prior, the George Floyd riots caused clearly far more material damage, loss of property and injuries and whatnot, and ultimately certain deaths. But very little in the way of punishment. Not only that, but it was not only lauded, but it was encouraged by the public health and political figures of the time as, basically, romper room time to run out and play and get your political feelings out, even though it was lockdown. So even in the context of lockdown, protesting from the left was seen as therapeutic and a far more benign, less violent intent, no firearm crowd which is, kind of really was the offspring of the what was that movement, the 2010
Occupy, the
yeah,
Occupy
the
Wall.
anti-occupy, they from the right, the kind of clean movement that wanted to cut
Tea
down
Party movement.
the Tea Party. Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
so much. So it's kind of like a Tea Party congener, relatively
Right.
speaking, in terms of the type of people there, kind of middle class, working class, etc.
Right.
Spending their own dime to get there.
Yeah.
And it just seems like it's to quote the current British preamp, his nickname of the current British Prime Minister, it's two-tier Keir. It seems like there's a double level of scrutiny and justice.
No, totally. And even if you just compare the damage done in Washington, D.C. on post-George Floyd to the January 6th, right? 60 Secret Service agents were injured. Donald Trump had to retreat to the bunker of the White House. The White House was under siege for like a week. That the George Floyd stuff lasted about 2 weeks in Washington. And there was, hundreds of millions of dollars of damage compared to the damage at the Capitol was, they say 2 million, but that mostly means replenishing the supplies of the gas they used and cleaning up the gas that they inadvertently sprayed all over the building. I mean, that was a big part of what's remarkable is how little vandalism there was, right? I mean, there was almost no vandalism inside the Capitol. I'd say, other than breaking windows and maybe doors and stuff, no one knocked over statues or defaced paintings or spray painted anything.
Yeah.
I keep
I
hearing
can
about
only imagine. I mean, there was the 2016, riots in Washington over Trump's election. Those seem to have
right,
gone down the memory hole.
Inauguration Day riots, right?
Yeah, and it's just it's so tiresome. Anyway, I recommend people buy your book. It's a reasonable memorial to Ashli Babbitt. We talked about that a little bit last time, and I look forward to maybe you're getting consulted on any kind of hearing and whatnot. It's a kind of a morass. And I'm reminded, I don't know if you read War and Peace, but I read it of a weekend in medical school. I probably should have been doing other things. Might explain some of my medical practice, but the Tolstoyan concept is that things happen that people can't predict when there's a crowd.
Right.
He kind of depicts the battles, and the generals are saying X, Y, and Z, and things happen. There's a rainfall, there's wind, there's rocks
the
that
fog
fall,
of war, right?
And people are just doing things on their own, and the battalions move not quite organically, but basically such. And it's a hard thing to parse out one way or another. But I do think that there's some general principles that you've limbed for us, which are that they didn't bring guns. Again, all these fall into the category of things that didn't happen. They didn't set fire to the place. They didn't make an actual Reichstag fire. They didn't burn the place down. They didn't take hostages. They didn't do any of the George Floyd-ish type things or anything the Antifa did. They didn't stay there and occupy. They didn't leave trash. And pretty much all the stories of the people who somehow were oppressed, like AOC or whatnot, don't really wash once they're brought out in public.
And then you read about New York Times did a story once, Randy, on the injuries suffered by the Capitol police officers, and we hear all about these injuries, beds beaten, and no, they lead with the story. One officer lost the tip of her pinky, right? Now, that's unfortunate. I don't want to lose the tip of my pinky, but I don't call that an insurrection when your greatest, that's what it leads with. That was the most serious injury they could find. Another officer suffered a concussion. I mean, okay, but that's an average day in the NFL. I mean, it's crazy. And we've elevated this to, an insurrection, lethal insurrection, disgrace, blah, blah, blah. Now it's time to straighten everything out right there. Now, we'll have to come back once we get that Truth and Reconciliation Commission up and running.
Absolutely. So I'm going to end with a little self-promotion here. This is my journey of discovery and exploration, debunking. It's overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. 2015-16 Brazil, it was the biggest pandemic to its time. It's been superseded by that one I'm trying to forget. And hopefully we'll forget all of these, but not until there's some truth and reconciliation. I'm hoping for Brazil to do some of that heavy lifting. I have the book out in Brazil as Descruindo, I can't even say it, O Zika. And it's the Portuguese version, but lies happen, and people kind of once things are going their way and they're getting some money from it, they keep at it.
Sure.
So I think there's a little bit of that here. Hopefully we'll get some reasonable solution for all this.
Well,
thanks so much,
Randy. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, and we'll talk to you in the near future.
All right, perfect.